As Steve takes his wife Karla for a stroll around his hometown of St. Catharines, Ontario, all both can think about are the streets they left behind in Central America. For the past 8 years, Steve Stoffelsen has been running a street ministry called Casa De Refugio, House of Refuge, in Guatemala. Every day they go into bars and clubs, reaching out to prostitutes and the homeless, sharing Jesus' love with anyone who will listen.
I just feel that that's where we're supposed to be. That's what God has called us to do, and there's no other place, again, that I'd rather be.
But Steve will be the first to admit that wasn't always the case. He wasn't always listening to God. Like many young people, Steve's teenage years were quite tumultuous.
I was drinking quite a bit, liked heavy metal music, and so my parents a lot of times would tell me it was satanic, and there were things that I needed to get my life right. A lot of times they would drag me to church on Sundays, and so they would.
So you didn't really want to go, but they'd take you along.
Yeah, I didn't want to go at all.
Yeah.
But I had to go, and I would sometimes be up late Saturday night, and then Sunday morning would come. And I didn't want to get up and go to church, but my parents would make sure that I got up and said, "You get ready, we're going to church." And so after quite a few years, then I think I was about 16, I was in a church, and a person actually came up to me, and because I always let people know that I didn't want to be there. I'd sit in church and I'd have my arms crossed.
You didn't hide your feelings.
And didn't hide my feelings at all.
But it wasn't until he was accused by a church member of taking drugs that he turned his back on God and turned towards the very thing he was accused of doing. Until one day when the very friends he used to party with started becoming Christians.
And I thought they were crazy. I thought what are they thinking?
Yeah.
And so as they began to serve the Lord, they formed a punk band. And so they were having this punk band at the church. So I went to hear the band that day, touched my life. Then another band came on, and it was actually more contemporary band. And that, I think, was the band that actually opened my heart up even more.
By the time the preacher finished speaking, Steve says he was convinced, and that day he chose to become a Christian once again. Soon after his conversion, he was offered a chance to go on a missions trip to Guatemala, and that's when he fell in love with the country. But little did he know that his past would help his growing ministry. We picked up the second part of our interview at Niagara Celebration Church, where the Stoffelsens attend when in Canada. Karla, Steve's wife, joined us for this portion of the interview.
God began to speak to me about the ministry and speak to me how I could reach out to these men. And so I was already given the tracts, I was already sort of doing something, but then I felt God, this was when God began to tell me about the lunches. He gave me the slogan for the ministry, which is loving the unloved, reaching the unreached. And I believe just at that time, God said, but now you can't give me any more time limits. He says, you're here until I tell you to go. And so 8 years later, I continue there.
He could relate with some of the men he was meeting on the streets. Taken over by drugs and alcohol, many of them had left their families, some even turning their backs on their faith. And so with a burden on his heart for these men who were calling the streets home, Casa De Refugio, House of Refuge, was born.
I'd sit down and talk to them and find out if they were married, if they had children, and many times we found out that that was the case. They were living on the streets, but yet they had a wife and they had children at home. And so we decided, well, we need to do something about this. So we decided, well, we'd get a house that we would rent where these guys could stay, disciple them and show them that there is a better hope, there is a new life that they can have.
At the same time Steve was making room for these men at the House of Refuge, he was also making room in his heart for a special young woman he had met from El Salvador. Soon Karla and Steve got married, and she joined him in ministry, specifically working with women pulled into prostitution. And as Steve explains, many of these women are not even from the country.
Yeah, a lot of times they, as they're trying to get to the States, they don't want to say, well, I'm from Nicaragua, or I'm from Honduras, or I'm from wherever. So they say Guatemala because that's the closest country to Mexico. They begin to look for jobs, and they're probably looking for decent jobs. The people right there in the town will say, no, we can't trust El Salvadorians. We can't trust Honduranians. We can't trust the Costa Ricans. You girls that come here, you have to go into prostitution.
But in a country where the bar owners control the actions of the prostitutes and also provide room and board for these women, reaching out to them with promises of God's love is a little more difficult. So over the years, Karla and Steve have built relationships with some of the bar owners, and once a week they will allow the women to have breakfast with Karla.
I have 1 hour with the women, and I see the Holy Spirit move and touch these women. They are mothers, they have families, and they are women. They have many pain in the heart. They need Jesus.
I believe that once they accept Jesus, it's up to him again to take them out of there.
And God has done just that, giving a couple of men and women the courage to leave their lifestyles behind.
For example, last year I see very close one woman. Her name is Sunilda. She's from Nicaragua. And she came out of the prostitution and the bar. She received Jesus. She going to the church. She learning. So
I want to share what Jesus.
But for Steve, it's the story of Juan Ramon that is a prime example of what they do and why they do it. Juan had abandoned his family and turned to alcohol. But when diagnosed with hepatitis B and given 10 days to live, he turned to Casa De Refugio for help.
And so when he had that news that within 10 days he could die, he began to think. And as he began to think about it, one thing that he said to God was, God, if you heal me, I will serve you. And so God took him at his word and healed him completely.
Now Juan has been reunited with his wife and children once again. And that is what Steve and Karla have learned throughout this journey. Anyone can change with God's help. Steve did, and now he's helping other men do the same.
And now you're helping men who are in drugs or, have been drinking. And so are you amazed how God has really just taken you full circle once again?
Yeah, it's, I mean, sometimes I look at it and say, wow, God, you have been working in my life the whole time.
Yeah.
You had me go through all those things so that now I understand how to work with these guys. Because it's, I think, a little bit easier. It's not impossible, but it is a little bit easier when somebody who has gone through it. When somebody can come to them and say, you know what, I know what you're going through. I understand what's happened, but now I want to show you the way out.
In St. Catharines, Ontario, Magdalene, John, 100 Huntley Street.